Welcome to Westminster Watch. I'm Nick de Bois. Coming up on the show, a terrible night for the Tories. 2 by-elections lost in the heartlands with record swings to Labour. But it's not all rosy for Keir Starmer. He's under fire from his own party over his strong support for Israel. And the Tories will be looking to capitalise on those divisions with a renewed focus on immigration. In a significant political victory, Labour have won 2 seats from the governing Conservative Party. Alistair Stratton won Mid-Bedfordshire, a Tory seat since 1931, by capitalising on resentment at the government and the outgoing MP, Nadine Dorries. While in Tamworth, Labour won back a seat they lost in 2010 with a record 24-point swing in their vote.
It is clear that the voters here have turned their back on a failed Tory government. They've had enough of the decline of the last 13 years and they are crying out for change, positive change that the Labour Party can bring them.
While Labour was celebrating over the weekend, within days there was the makings of a political problem for Keir Starmer after this radio interview.
I'm very clear. Israel must have that, does have that right to defend herself, and Hamas bears responsibility. I think that Israel does have that right. It is an ongoing situation. Obviously, everything should be done within international law.
Starmer's team insisted that he simply meant that Israel had the right to self-defence, but there's been a significant backlash within the party. Over 120 Muslim councillors have written to the Labour leadership urging them to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. The party's Muslim MPs also met Starmer to urge him to change his position. It might just cost the party votes as it prepares to come in from the cold after 13 years in opposition. All of this brings back memories of the divisions under Jeremy Corbyn. With Labour currently well ahead in the polls, the Tories will be hoping to reopen some of those old wounds. Their first step? A tougher approach on immigration. Ministers have vowed to end the asylum backlog by the end of the year and stop housing migrants in hotels while their claims are processed. Home Secretary Suella Braverman will relaunch a scheme to fly failed asylum seekers to Rwanda if the Supreme Court approves it. That tougher line on migration is being copied across Europe. France's Interior Minister is planning a massive overhaul of the migration system and warns the country will bypass the European Court of Human Rights by deporting dangerous migrants before their appeals are heard, even if they face the death penalty or torture.
We have to continue to move forward, notably on taking control of our borders. The Migration Pact is important for that. Notably, when it comes to identifying people on our territory, being able to do security interviews so as to separate them from people who could be dangerous.
And now let's bring in our panel. Joining us today are Claire Short, former British Secretary of State for International Development, Nabila Ramdani, a journalist and author of Fixing France, and Mark Garnier, British Member of Parliament and former Minister at the Department of International Trade. Welcome. Claire Short, you were part of the 1997 Labour landslide that swept Tony Blair into power. 1996, Labour Party were winning by-elections. They're doing it again now. What parallels do you see, between, if any, between now and 1997? And what pitfalls do you think await Keir Starmer?
I think there are parallels, and I think it's that the Tory party was tired and factional and people thought it ought to go, so that gives the great big space to Labour. But I think people, when we had John Smith as leader, who was very, very popular and very decent man, then Tony the young man. So there was this sense of Labour in a good place. People liked the young Prime Minister with a young family. They remembered John. And then, of course, we won by-elections that we lost later, but there was an enthusiasm for Labour. I think the difference now is we're winning by-elections, extraordinary ones that have never been Labour before, but not much enthusiasm. And it's much more a complete collapse of the Tory vote and a very slight, if any, increase in the Labour vote. In both of the recent ones, what do they call them, the now Brexit Party reform?
Yes.
They got more than Labour's majority. So that's the difference. I mean, I think it's bad news for the Tory party in the sense it's the same, but Labour is not... People are fed up with the Tories and they're voting Labour because that's the way to change the government, but they're not full of enthusiasm.
And Mark, Claire's analysis is basically people are fed up with the Tories and the government, the Conservative government, seem to be trying all sorts of things to re-energise the public. But let me put this to you. In the summer, the Conservatives had a surprise by-election win holding Boris Johnson's seat, and then there was a pivot by the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, to, of all things, present himself as the change candidate, buying into the idea that the public want change, and he, who has been at the head of government for several years, over a 13-year Tory administration, is the candidate of change. I mean, that failed in these by-elections, didn't it? So what next? What can the Tories do?
Well, look, so it's very interesting. So I'm not going to try to pretend that we haven't had an absolutely disastrous night last week. I mean, if you look at the drop of the vote in those constituencies, so by-elections always have a very low turnout. But pretty much 100% of the drop in the vote was attributable to the drop in the Conservative vote. And we were down by about 65% on both of them. So we have to own up to that. But you're absolutely right to mention that Uxbridge by-election, because when it comes down to an issue which people are passionate about, and in this particular case it was you, Les, actually people do come out to vote. Claire's point, I think, is absolutely right. I mean, if I can summarise what you've just said, Keir Starmer is no Tony Blair. And I think that's the thing. Tony Blair...
But it wasn't only Tony. I'm saying it was a continuity of John Smith, Labour standing for something better.
I agree.
It's not just Tony. Everyone talks as though nothing was there and then New Labour came along. I don't think that's true.
But the well of politics is empty. There isn't that much support for the well of politics. But look, I'd say two things to think about. There was, I think, running up to the 1992 general election, we lost 15 by-elections and we still won the 92 election. And to flip it the other way, when we went into the 2017 by-election, 2017 general election, we were 15 points ahead, as when Theresa May called that election. We lost our majority. So it's still all to pay for.
But isn't part of the problem for the Conservatives...
I think if I could just say, things are more fluid than they've ever been.
Yeah.
People can swing and move around and in a way that didn't used to be.
Yeah.
So your analysis, Claire, is that Keir Starmer could still lose this?
I think the Tories have probably lost it, but I think Labour might well not get an overall majority. And then,
Labour hasn't won it yet.
Yes,
That's
and
right,
then we'd have a hung parliament with Labour as the largest single party, having to reach agreements with the Lib Dems and the SNP. I don't think it'll be a coalition. I think there'll be agreements on programmes. I
think that's a good point. So, Nabila Ramdani, in your book, Fixing France, you hypothesise that to get more consensual politics, what Claire was referring to, that actually do away with the president and have an elected prime minister accountable to Parliament. Now, we have that here in the UK, and as a keen observer of international politics, do you think that we actually have more consensual politics here, even at this time when, you know, to people like me, I think the country's more polarised than ever?
Well, I think you certainly have more democracy, and that's the crux of any civilised nation.
How so?
Well, one of the core arguments in my book is to say that essentially the French system needs fixing, and urgent fixing, not least of all because of the presidential system, which was the current one, which was born of the Fifth Republic, if you like, which was born directly out of the crisis in Algeria. The Algerian War of Independence precipitated chaos in France, not just in Algeria. And a strong man was brought in, if you like, in the shape of Charles de Gaulle, to keep everybody in check. But ever since then, that meant that he was given, any president who came after him, retained those extraordinary powers that he was given, meaning that he can rule by decree, he can choose his prime minister, and he can choose members of his cabinet. And I say he because there's always been an alpha male president in France. There's never been a woman president. So that system, for me, is not fit for purpose anymore.
But wouldn't you say, to draw the analogy with Britain, if I may, and Mark, let me ask you this first of all, don't you think we got presidential-style politics here? Is that part of the problem?
Well, and Thatcher, of course.
Yeah, no. So people think we have, and that's part of the problem. So actually, we have parliamentary democracy. So when people go into to vote for an election, of course, they vote for their local member of parliament. But I've seen, and you've probably seen this, anybody who's been an elected politician standing at a polling station, people coming out and saying, I wanted to vote for Tony Blair, Liz Truss, whoever it happens to be, but it wasn't on the ballot paper, so I didn't do it. And that's what they're voting for.
Well,
they're
that
voting
is,
for these figures.
But Claire, is it President Starmer? Is he the strong card for Labour or the weak link?
Well, I just want to say our system gives enormous power to the executive, coming back from Crown prerogatives. And now the way politics has changed, there's more and more power concentrated in the Prime Minister. Cabinet government doesn't really work. Government doesn't take much notice of backbenchers. They just have to be loyal. So I think there are parallels with your critique of France. Ours looks different, I agree with you. But I think it's malfunctioning. Politics is in trouble in most places. We have to ask, why is that?
Well, that is fair, but bring it back to the by-elections. Is it Starmer who won that, or is it, the if you like, the Tories that lost it?
I mean, people don't like Starmer like they like Blair, but I think it's isn't only Starmer the person, it's the people around him telling him to be so cautious, not say anything, not stand for anything.
Well,
and people, if they want to change, they want to change to something.
Well, OK, it may be unstoppable, the call for change, if you like, and that will obviously be bad news for the Conservatives. But let's move on to looking at how and it is admittedly looking through the domestic lens, how the events in Gaza and Israel have actually transformed in a week what looked like a very unstoppable Labour Party to a Labour Party that is vulnerable at the moment. So, Claire Short, perhaps I can begin with you. Starmer has effectively ended up trying to use his unquestionable support for Israel, following the Prime Minister's lead very much, to shake off the curse of anti-Semitism that was seen running through the Labour Party, particularly under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. But in doing so, hasn't he inadvertently created what's likely to become his worst party management problem that we will see for some time?
He's got a big problem. And firstly, we must not accept that the suggestion that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. Israel has become more and more authoritarian and cruel and breaking international law, not just now, but for years and years. Settlers in the occupied territories, that's illegal, and so on and so on. Otherwise, we might have got the Palestinian state and not be in this condition. And now the bombardment is way disproportionate, grave breaches of international law. And Starmer just... I mean, Labour's always had a strong feeling for the UN, for international law as the way to govern the world post-colonialism. And he's just blown it. And Labour's trying to be loyal, but this is too much. 7,000 people dead, nearly half of them children, and on it goes. He's lost it.
I think we need to talk about that specific bit about what's going on in Gaza. But I think on the point about Keir Starmer, I think he's made two profound mistakes. The first is if you look at the number of Labour voters there are out there, I kind of ran some numbers, there's 3.9 million Muslims out there. There's probably about 1.55 million.
Some estimates as high as 2 million voters.
Well, I've been quite conservative. I mean, potentially, according to an Evening Standard survey that was published yesterday, I think, they've gone down from 72% of Muslims voting for Labour to 5%. That means he's lost. He's down to, about 140,000 Muslim voters from nearly as high as 2 million, as you say.
And those voters went right down after the Iraq War, and they came back. So they've disconnected a bit once before.
They have, but it's an interesting point. I mean, that's about 15% of Labour voters at the last general election. But look, I think the other point is Keir Starmer's ability. So Keir is a very, very talented, very clever individual. I don't necessarily agree with what he says, but he's a very clever individual. He's now finding that he's in the position of being the Prime Minister. Everybody now expects him to be the next Prime Minister. And he hasn't got used to being able to get the right message out. And he was very, very cack-handed when he made that comment the other day, which has caused this problem. And this shows that he's yet to learn that maturity about how to be not just a leader in opposition, but a leader of a country in government. He hasn't got there yet.
But also, he didn't have a feel for the principle.
Yes.
You're right about the maturity, but there's a massive principle here. And to just talk as though killing and killing and killing and slaughtering people in Gaza is all right because some people broke out and killed some people wrong is just not good enough.
Nabila, yes.
The very principle of not supporting humanitarian aid and not calling for an immediate ceasefire is absolutely appalling. And I think he's overdone the Corbyn hate.
Sorry to interrupt you, but calling for a ceasefire this early, some would say...
Early?
No, we're talking about... This was over 9 days ago when Keir Starmer made that interview. So if we cast our minds back to that point, calling for a ceasefire at that point, President Biden hasn't done it, no European leaders are calling for it. The EU are now calling for a pause along with the US and UK because they would see that as giving a horrible tactical
But it's not because they're on the wrong side of history that a leftist politician should follow suit. I think he's overdone the Corbyn hate, not least of all because he was supporting him at the last general election, so he comes across as a rank hypocrite. And if you think about the tradition of Labour politicians in the UK, they're very much internationalists. You know, they stand up for the rights of the oppressed around the world. And, you know, he's marked a complete departure from that tradition. And dare I say, he's following in Blair's footsteps, the man who went into Iraq. And he
in breach of international law, because the UN didn't approve it.
Precisely. And he seems to be more like a Blairite than anything else. He loves all the values that Blair liked, money, you know, that kind of stuff. So I think he's doing his party a huge disservice. But I do not think, having said all that, that the Muslim vote will be crucial for him to lose the UK general election.
Well,
I think it will affect the Scottish vote as well, by the way.
Frontbench colleagues are actually saying, those that are speaking out, are saying to Starmer that you should not trade your position that you have taken to date, in other words, change the position in response to the uproar that's within parts of his party, because of a transaction to keep Muslim votes, that this is a huge matter of principle. Is that how you see it?
I see it as a huge matter of principle, and he's absolutely wrong on the principle that the Secretary-General of the United Nations was right. Yes, there's a right of self-defence, but that doesn't mean killing 7,000 people and going on and on, half of them children. That's not self-defence. This is revenge. This is slaughter. It's wrong. It's disproportionate. And, of course, the cutting off of water and so on is complete breach of international humanitarian law. And Starmer was a human rights lawyer. If he just stood for international law, we'd be in a better position. Whereas they're all running down. Of course, the original killings were horrible. But this is disproportionately terrible.
Are we seeing what's happening here elsewhere in Europe, Nabila? In terms of politicians who came out very early on and took a very robust, some would say giving licence to Israel to go ahead and invade at that time. Remember, we were talking about invasion within days. Are they seeing a backlash of significance as Keir Starmer is facing, where Muslims in those countries believe...
Can I just say it's not only Muslims?
No, I was going to...
The people in Oxford, when Labour's lost the balance of power, they're not Muslim.
But
I mean, so...
8 councillors have resigned, which lost them in Oxford, you're right.
And they're not Muslim. I mean, I just want it not... I want Muslim people to remember there's lots of people who are not Muslim who agree with them.
But to typify the question, are they getting a lot of pushback because of that stand now?
Yes, I mean, I can tell you, for one, I cover the pro-Palestine demonstrations in Paris, for example, which are regularly banned, because if the government disagrees with the message, then they ban the demonstrations. Now, they come to their senses, and now they're allowing them. And I can assure you, you can see people from all faiths and no faiths, Christians, Jews, atheists, and what they are opposed to, essentially, is the loss of lives. And they want... both Palestinians and Israelis to have a state of their own and to live side by side peacefully.
Do you think that despite the horrors of what we've seen both in Israel and in Gaza, that ultimately this might be a catalyst for the two-state solution initiative to take some pace?
Well, I hope that will be a catalyst to treat Israel as a pariah nation, to bring it to justice, in front, bearing in mind, you know, international law.
But notwithstanding that, wouldn't the two-state solution...
But that will be the step towards a solution. criminalising Israel for its regular breaches of its war crimes, and let's investigate everybody who's committed war crimes.
But isn't that part of the problem? That actually we're busy saying, you're bad Hamas here, you're bad Israel here. The question I'm asking is, can this...
The two states would be, the Palestinian state would be Gaza, the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And that's where it was meant to be.
Yeah.
And Arafat gave up 78% of historical Palestine to have that state. And Israel didn't allow that. And now
yes, but Nabila's talking about accountability. I'm saying get to the two-state solution.
So Israel is putting settlers, taking more and more control of the territory that would be the Palestinian state.
What next for the Conservatives to shore up their flagging stop the boats promise?
So, look, Nick, you know I'm a one-nation conservative, so I get very uncomfortable when we start talking about waves of invading refugees coming across, or asylum seekers coming across the Channel. But I have had 2 hotels in my constituency, and there's a lot of local concern about it. And it's not concern that people feel, sort of instinctively racist. Because we've had Syrian refugees who've been given asylum. We've had Ukrainian refugees, BNO, Hong Kong passport holders. Yeah. So they are welcome, but it's just this sort of sense of justice. Anyway, one of my hotels has been closed, or will close down at the end of February, and then moving on. Now, the reason it's come down is actually because some of this has been successful. So boats coming across the Channel is down by from 36,000 to 26,000, and there's been as much opportunity this year for boats to come across. So that's worked. Albanian refugees are down by 90% because of the policy of sending them straight back. So this is beginning to work. But actually, this is not a Suella Braverman sort of harsh rhetoric problem. This is a global problem. And we've seen in France, President Macron is now prepared to defy...
Before we get on to France, if I may, I've got to ask you, Claire, it's the number 2 issue for the public in Britain, immigration, just behind the economy. And it's quite evidently one of the constant leading news stories. Labour said nothing about this. Keir Starmer didn't mention it in his conference speech. Is it not a priority, or are Labour running scared on this?
Well, Labour are just saying you didn't process the cases enough, so we got the big backlog and therefore all the hotels. That's the critique, and there's something in that.
Although that has been resolved. We've now gone from 500 being processed a week to 5,000.
Yeah. Well, there's an argument about where they're dumping some of... Anyway, that's a bigger question.
To the point, yeah.
But my real point, and this is to everyone, the Geneva Convention needs renegotiating. This system is run by criminals, and the people who come pay them a lot of money. And they're not the most needy political asylum seekers in the world. And of course, the way the system works is once people arrive, they've got legal rights, and then they're here for quite a long time while they exercise those legal rights. And that's why people throw away their passports, so they can't be sent home. So I think we need to renegotiate the Geneva Convention, give the UN High Commission for Refugees power to look after anyone fleeing, and then all our countries take decent numbers of families in the way that the small number of Syrian families
let me finally, if I may, bring Nabila in on this point. Macron, he talks about we have to work together. He's talking about the EU, but he's basically saying we have to work together on the one hand, whilst being quite tough on the other, with the latest claims about how they don't want to let terrorists in on the back of asylum seekers and kick them out straight away. Their language, not mine. Is he right about cooperation? Is Claire right? Or are we just going to continue seeing countries trying to come up with solutions to push the problem elsewhere?
Well, the whole point of the EU is consensus and collaboration, but evidently Brexit, threatened all that because it's been disrupted.
The EU still exists.
The EU still exists. I think...
Actually, Brexit may have made it stronger, actually, because some people have seen what a disaster. Yeah. But sorry.
Yes, but I think generally countries deal with immigration on a case-by-case basis. They look at their own situation. For example, you would notice that Germany takes a lot more immigrants than any other country.
Well, they did, but they're talking tough now. So isn't the problem that you can't get the consensus you think they should?
They try to rebrand their image from, to shift the past image of the horrors of the Second World War into a more liberal, welcoming democracy. And that's why they're taking more migrants in, I'm assuming. France is taking quite a lot of migrants themselves, although the rhetoric is shifting towards a populist, more xenophobic language, not least of all embodied by parties such as the National Rally with Marine Le Pen. So I don't think there's is a consensus on how to deal with migrants. And you look at countries like Italy, for example, they're constantly complaining that they're bearing the brunt of the migrants because they are the first port of entry.
Thank you very much indeed, Claire Shaw, former Secretary of State for International Development in the last Blair government. Mark Garnier, former Minister in the current government, Member of Parliament for Wye Forest, and Nabila Ramdani, author, of course, of Fixing France. Thanks again to my guests for joining me, and don't forget to check out TRT World for more lively debate and conversation. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.